All right, welcome up. Here we are again, working our way through critical thinking. So just always good to review, take it back, get an overall look at things so you're not lost. Um, so you're not at the point where you can't see the forest because of the trees, right? You got to see the forest. We work best understanding the general, and that means on occasion, or maybe every time you sit down to study something, get back to the general idea, right? Constitution, what is it about? Six basic principles, the primary principle. People are sovereign. And after that, the next several principles are about keeping the powers that be at bay, temporary, transient, separate, and so forth, right? So that the people can remain in power. This great democratic experiment, which was the first of its kind. Uh, Basically, there was nothing going on. Speaking of that, July 4th is coming up, 250 years. So before this country, before the American Revolution, um, all countries were run by monarchs, dictators, right? There was sovereignty, but it resided in one individual, the king, right? So, but now we are the king, right? So the people are sovereign, right? How do you remain sovereign? By allowing the people to think, well, think freely. The freer we are to think as we need to or desire, the better off we are. So critical thinking is the foundation of freedom. Is that the foundation of freedom or the concept of freedom? You don't need critical thinking if you're being dictated to by a king, right? You just do what they say, do what you're told. But here, you have choices. So in order to make choices, you've got to be able to think well, think critically, logically, coherently, cohesively, with solid reasoning, fact based, discipline, humble, all that good stuff, right? Fair minded, right? That's there it is. That's the first chapter, right? So the first thing we want to be is fair minded because again, it's about the people. All people are included. We're sharing this country, right, with other people. So in order to be sharing with other people, we need to be fair minded first and foremost, right? So we know what. First of all, we find out what that means, right? Then you can determine where you are. If you look at the first four stages, where are you in your fair-minded critical thinking, right? Uh, don't know anything, barely aware, been working on a little bit. Maybe the fourth step is I've got a pretty good start on things, but I need to keep going. Got a ways to go, right? Then you got to reach outside of yourself, look at the complex world around you. Then you go back in, break it down, what you were just talking about, this fair-minded critical thinking stuff. So you got to break it apart, right? In order to analyze something, use critical thinking, analyze, synthesize, judge, right? You got a problem, first you got to analyze it. How do you do that? Observing, but using knowledge, existing knowledge, your existing knowledge, and new knowledge, and synthesize that, tie it together, and then apply it to your analysis, and then make a judgment, right? So, in order to really understand that stuff, you have to pull the thinking apart and take a look at it, right? If a car's not working, maybe an engine's not working, you got to pull the thing, pull it out, pull it apart. Let's see why it's not working, right? To make it work. Then you've got to get some standards. Alan Bloom, Bloom, talked about a need for standards in education, a need for standards in communication, a need for standards in being American so that we can communicate with each other and function well with each other and get things accomplished in our lives, in our workplace, in our communities, right? You need a standards of communication, right? The reason why we don't have good communication sometimes, even if you speak your own language, even if everybody's speaking the same language, I should say, is that we're not getting our message across. The other person's not listening, and we're not making ourselves clear. But the first and foremost obvious reason for a lack of understanding, especially if you're talking about all the other people in the world, is a lack of standards. They're not a standard language. There are a whole bunch of different languages, right? So communication obviously is going to break down all the way down to no communication, especially if you don't understand the other language or languages, right? Okay, so we get the standards. Then you have to start doing some probing. How do you do that? Ask questions. Then we get back to the thinking. Now we've been exposed to the thinking, looked at the parts. Now that you looked at the parts and the standards, let's master it, right? So this is all logical, right? And then you talk about that. Then how do you get some more information on mastering thinking? Well, you look at the best thinkers, those who have mastered it, right? Since this is a college textbook, this is geared towards the college student. We're going to talk about grades, right? As levels of thinking and learning. Right? So now this gets applied. We were in the macro, now we go to the micro, right? Because this text is geared towards the student, right? Then we get to the bottom part. There's the three parts, right? Analyze, synthesize, judge, or solve problems, come up with a decision, right? Now we take a look at that. You see how it's going through logically through. What's one of the most important developmental forms in writing, thinking, communicating? There's all these developmental forms. Developmental forms in writing are basically ways to communicate or things to focus on as you communicate, right? What do I want to do? Do I want to draw somebody a picture? Do I want to compare and contrast? Do I want to argue? Do I want to illustrate? What do I want to do, right? So argumentation and argumentation is academia, right? All those other developmental forms, there's numerous other ones, maybe 7, 8, 9, depending on your opinion. But argumentation is probably the most important because that's the one we're using most of our time. We even have to argue with ourselves, right? Oh, should I get up and eat that? Should I go to the gym? You're even arguing with yourself, right? And arguing is not, bashing somebody upside the head and screaming. That's not argumentation, but it's providing, analyzing something, providing solid evidence and facts, and then coming up with a decision, right? A judgment. What am I going to do, right? Then now we have to get more into the mind. We kind of understand the surface stuff. Now we have to go deeper. And the irrational mind is the conscious, subconscious, right? 2 levels. Then there's the unconscious, way below. And that's something else that you have to deal with. But I don't think the book deals with that too much. But we got enough problems with the conscious, subconscious, right? As I was telling my students just yesterday in class, that we are our own worst enemies. We are our own worst enemy, right? We're going to block ourselves from thinking well or getting something done, or limiting ourselves in some way because of our basic pride or human nature or just general limitations, right? So you really got to work to overcome that. It's a conscious. There you go. That's a good word to use right now, right? Because conscious, subconscious. It's a conscious effort to get things done, to think well, right? And you also want to be ethical, and that's where we are now, right? So all that stuff was talked about, but what do you want to do? There has to be some more. There's a moral. We're humans, right? So the moral or ethical dilemma is now rising. So now we're getting towards the more the higher end stuff, right? And that's usually how it works, right? Well, look, we can See the light at the end of the tunnel. We're getting down there, right? There's chapter 20 of the last one. But developing as an ethical reasoner, right? We're starting like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We've kind of gone through the bottom stuff is definitional, basic, rudimentary, elementary stuff, right? Bottom stuff is we need food and shelter and relationships, and then you move up. You got to have some type of work that you're doing to sustain yourself, to fulfill yourself in life, and then all the way up to the top. The top is self-actualization, right? And that's kind of where the ethical stuff comes in, right? We're trying to not just learn this as a neutral tool, but apply some non-neutrality to it, right? Because anybody can use critical thinking. Some of the most evil people use it and use it well, right? Politicians. Case point right there. So look, we go right back to fair-mindedness, right? One of the most significant obstacles to fair-mindedness is the human tendency to reason in self-serving, self-deluded. There it is. Can I say? There it is. That's exactly what I was just talking about. Remember, I was talking about my students getting a little bit of that from me yesterday. The class I'm teaching is a composition. It's not even critical thinking, but there's a critical thinking component to the class, nevertheless. So one of the most significant, now also as I was teaching my class, critical thinking, critical reading, a critical reader is always looking for key words and phrases. Significant means most important, high end, at the very top. Pretty prevalent, right? That's pretty significant. That's a significant problem, right? What's the main problem with the team this year? Significant obstacle is a lack of key clutch hitting, right? So that's always something to focus on. So there are obstacles, right? So that we can actually highlight that too. Like, let me do that. Significant obstacles to fair-mindedness is the human tendency. Look at the words, right? We have a tendency or propensity, or a better chance than not, to reason in a self-serving, self-deluded manner, right? Just go online, social media. You can go onto the sports chats. You go onto the political chats or comment sections or articles or whatever is out there, right? Business, whatever, education, doesn't matter. There's a lot of people will often say that person is selfish and delusional. Well, we all are. Welcome. Go, really? Must be a human, right? So we all have that to some degree. And if you're throwing those terms around, he's a selfish, deluded person. Selfish, self-deluded person. Well, so are you. So the humble thing to do, there you go, critical thinking, an element of critical thinking that not a lot of people think about, right? Being humble. Humble is just realistic, right? So the humble thing to do is to realize, we've all got these things in us, these shortcomings, right? So, and eliminate them? Probably not. But limit them. Yeah, you can definitely do that, right? I know I have. A lot of your best thinkers and workers in those areas have done it. This tendency is increased by the extent to which people are confused about the natural nature of ethical concepts and principles. To understand ethical reasoning, the following foundations are, there it is, like essential. So I can just kind of wing through these and forget about them. No, essential means probably going to have to know them and apply them to your general everyday life for the rest of your life, right? And critical thinking is a tool, a way of thinking or being, right? Because remember, first things begin in thoughts, and then or words, thought. Uh, then they turn into, after a while, hopefully beliefs. Beliefs founded in good ethical reasoning, right? Beliefs, and then you put them into the environment, and then they become acts, and then they become habits, and then they become a way of life and character, right? Ethical principles are not a matter of subjective preference. There you go. That's interesting, right? I'll have to highlight that. There are so many things said in this book. Probably should get to all of these. Well, not all of them, but some of the most important is tattooed. I'll read them every day. All reasonable people are obligated to respect clear-cut ethical concepts and principles. Hopefully, potentially, right? To reason well through ethical issues, you must know how to apply ethical concepts and principles reasonably to those issues. That's common sense, no? Ethical concepts and principles are clearly distinguished from the norms and taboos of society and peer groups, religious teachings, political ideologies, and the law. I like that. So these ethical concepts are distinct from the norms, taboos of societies, peer group, society, peer groups, religious teachings, political ideologies, and the law, right? The most significant barriers to sound ethical reasoning are the egocentrism and sociocentrism of human beings. So that's a lot to unpack, right? So we've got about 20 pages of unpacking to do here. First, we will seek to clarify the problem posed by ethics in human life, what ethics is. And this is another thing that I talked about to my students the other day. I had them look at an example of critical thinking in action. And there is a scientist by the name of Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably heard of him. And he was asked, do you believe in UFOs? And it took him about 12 minutes to respond to that question, because there's a lot there, right? And the first thing he did was define, what is, so people who are trained to think well, they realize that they first of all, let's stop. Like when I was studying, I'll get back to Neil in a second. When I was first studying education, I wanted to do something, and I ended up coaching. I wanted to do something more than just teach. I wanted to really understand what education is, right? What it was, what it is, what it will be, that type of thing, right? How's it going? Where's it going? So I had to define it. And how do you define it? Well, go back to the beginning, right? Go back to the very start. What was education in the very beginning of this country 250 years ago, right? And it was basically moms teaching their kids letters so that they could read the Bible or scriptures, right? Most jobs back then were very rudimentary and life preserving, right? You were probably cutting down trees or taking care of the animals or hunting for food for meals and stuff, right? There wasn't, you weren't on the internet or going off being an accountant, doctor, lawyer. There's some doctors, but rudimentary, right? And there were lawyers, but again, very rudimentary. Very few and far between. Most were, living off of the land and providing for themselves within the home, the homestead, right? Most people were not going off. There weren't that many towns to begin with, right? We're going off townships developed as time passed, and more organized structures of human interaction and needs, and civic needs were brought to being, right? But in the very beginning, it was just survival. Anyway, so definition. Got to pace a bit there. Definition. What is? Well, let's see. He said, deGrasse Tyson stopped and said, "Well, let's see." And that's what a good critical thinker does. So just dive in and start blabbering. Wait a minute. Let me ask myself some questions, proper questions. Let's see. Let's begin at the beginning. What is UFO? Unidentified flying object. What does the U stand for? Unidentified, right? And then he went from there definitionally. So what is ethics, right? What is critical thinking? What does it mean to be, what is an American, right? Um, what is economics? What is ethics? What is theology? What is fill in the blank, right? Mathematics or engineering or law, right? Any of those basic concepts. Its basis, what it is commonly confused with, its pitfalls. That's interesting. What is it commonly confused with? That's an interesting caveat, an aside, right? Pitfalls, how it is to be understood. Following that discussion, we emphasize three essential components in sound ethical reasoning: the principles upon which ethics is grounded, the counterfeits to avoid, and the pathologies of the human mind. Interesting, right? Um, so principles. First, you have to look at definitionally what is ethics, right? And then you have to look at the fake news or the misinformation, right? Fake news. I don't think that'll apply there, but misinformation, right? The wrong stuff that people think ethics is, right? And then you have to look at the frailties of the human mind as well, right? Why people are confused. So you're not even defining ethics yet, really, right? Uh, before there's a book called Thick Face Black Card that I have my students read. It's probably been in the public arena for 80, 90 years or so. And it's based in ancient Chinese philosophy, success philosophy, right? And it's originally called Thick Black Theory, but a woman who came over here from Taiwan wrote about it. She was I think she's passed in recent years, but she was a businesswoman and she talked about Thick Black Theory and wrote the book Thick Face Black Heart to help people become successful, right? Um, and one of the first things, probably the second chapter, first chapter, guess what it did? It defined what thick face black heart is. What is thick face? What is black heart? Right? Definition. There it is again. Right? If it's a good idea, if it works once in one place, it's probably going to work again and again in other places. So use it. So in the second and third chapters actually are dharma, or a basic coming to a basic understanding of what we need to do to fulfill our basic human needs. She spoke to the concept of dharma, right? We have to follow our dharma. It's kind of like your basic instincts, your intuition, right? But then the third chapter was unlearning. There were certain things that we've learned that needed to be unlearned. So this is kind of an unlearning, right? The ultimate basis for ethics is clear. Human behavior has consequences for the welfare of others, right? So one of the problems, just like with history, I've taught my students have read some history primers, so lies my teachers have told me and other primers about the misinformation given to most American students in U.S. history classes at the probably the secondary level. You get better history lessons in college, right? They're more accurate because usually in school it's more about suppressing or bypassing history that it does not help to make the United States or put the United States in a good light, or to put the country, or I'm sorry, the state that you're using the textbooks in, you want that the state and also your country to be put in a good light. So, not that it's telling outright lies, but it's glossing over things or just avoiding things altogether. But anyways, so there you go. We are capable of acting towards others in such a way as to increase or decrease the quality of our lives. That's it. Isn't that what it's all about? Increasing the quality of your life. We are capable of helping or harming others. What's more, we are capable of understanding, at least in many cases, when we are helping and when we are harming others. How about that one? And we probably know. And sometimes we ignore it. Sometimes we don't want to think about it. Sometimes we don't care. Or we've trained ourselves to be so callous and harsh and selfish that we just think whatever. And of course, that's dangerous. This is so because we have the raw, though usually undeveloped, capacity to put ourselves imaginatively in the place of others and recognize how we would feel if someone were to act towards us in a manner in which we are acting toward them, right? The golden rule, treat others as you would treat yourself, right? And most people are in tune with that, connected to that. Some more than others. Some that's become a little bit of a dull area, which needs to be woken up, right? Even young children have some idea of what it is to help or harm others. You can see very small kids, uh, interacting with other kids or animals, and understanding that this is a living being. They probably have, the same reaction to things as I do, right? Well, not that rationally well thought through, but the sentiment is there. Children make inferences and judgments on the basis of their ethical awareness, and they develop an outlook on life that has ethical significance for good or ill. But children tend to have a much clearer awareness of the harm done to them than they have the harm, than they have the harm they do to others. That's true, right? Yeah, that's not fair. So if there's something that's going on that's not fair from the other person's end, yeah, we really don't notice that much, I'll take 3 cookies, here's one, no problem, right? But if it's the other way, I'm taking 3 cookies, here's, oh, that's not fair, right? That type of thing. So, and there's some examples, right? Through example and encouragement, we can cultivate fair-mindedness in children. Children can learn to respect the rights of others, not simply focus on their own desires. The main problem is not so much the difficulty of deciding what is helpful and what is harmful, but instead our natural propensity to be egocentric, right? Few humans think at a deep level about the consequences to others of their selfish pursuit of money, power, prestige, and possession. True. I've been thinking in more recent years, maybe as you get older and I don't know, you start to see things differently, right? Stuff that you used to focus on one way after some time and experience and maybe some deep, sensitizing. You don't want to be desensitized. Sensitizing, being sensitized to what's going on, right? Uh, I looked at winning games. When a team wins, the team celebrates, the fan celebrates. But meanwhile, the other team, the other fans are feeling pretty crappy, and here you are in their face celebrating. So talk about not caring. I never used to think about the other team or the other players. I was just like, yay, my team. And Then I think as you get older, more mature, and more sensitized to things, you start to say, not that I'm crying, believe me, not that I'm crying when the Yankees lost to my Red Sox. I wasn't crying, believe me. But you know, I do definitely have thought about it, entertained the thought, whereas before I never even thought about it. Right. Anyways, the result is that although most people, independent of their society, ethnicity, and religion, give at least lip service to a common core of general ethical principles, that it is ethically wrong to cheat, deceive, exploit, steal from others, that we have an ethical responsibility to respect the rights of others, including their freedom, well-being, to help those most in need of help, to seek the common good, not merely our own self-interest, egocentric pleasures, and to strive to make the world more just and humane. Few act consistently upon these principles. Can I highlight that in red? You know, I wish I could. Right. All of this, ultimately, few. You know, uh, we know. You know, it's wrong to cheat, deceive, exploit, abuse, harm, steal, whatever. You know, take away the rights of others, to limit others, to limit their freedoms or well-being. And you talk, but you know, as far as being there consistently and thinking outside of the self, kind of like in a reflective manner, you know, seeing ourselves in that person, like we're not always looking at a mirror. Very rarely, we always, I don't want to say always, we frequently, at most on most occasions, we see that person and we don't see ourselves there. We don't feel ourselves. We don't see ourselves there, right? So we are kind of that's the natural human tendency, right? You got to be careful of the natural man, as they say in maybe Christian, maybe I've heard that in like Catholicism lessons, Catholic lessons. Um, you know, we don't do that naturally, and it's very difficult to be there. And I think after a while in some training, you know, you grow up, especially if you grow up and you're the older brother or sister, and you've got that's where it begins, you know, take care of your little brother or sister. So your parents are passing that parental perspective and responsibility down to you. You know, you're the oldest one, Steve. Be nice to your brothers and sisters, right? You set the example, right? So that's kind of our first exposure of our out of body, out of mind, the other, considering the other, right? And then probably, you know, maybe in the workplace or maybe in the sports team, you know, in athletics, we might feel or see that again some more. But then it really takes place when you become a parent, right? It becomes much more apparent to be outside of oneself when you become a parent, right? Right. So I think, and as we progress, you know, hopefully we can become more consistent. It's never going to be 100% easy or 100% natural thing to just immediately think about the other. And sometimes that's not safe. That's not good because you do want to protect yourself, right? So it can't just be total selflessness, ignoring the self. It's like, I don't matter. You know, you put your hand on a burner, you burn your hand. A truck's coming, you just walk in front of the truck. Not to that point, right? Where you're just totally selfless and not caring about yourself. That can be destructive or dangerous too, right? So there has to be a balance. Right? United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which all countries have ratified, articulates universal ethical principles. And a core of ideas defines the domain of ethicality and ethics for reasonable people in a broad global way. Many fail to act in accordance with ethical principles, however. At an abstract level, there is little disagreement. That's true, right? At the abstract level, very easy to do it at the abstract level. It's easy to talk the talk, but hard to walk the walk. That's why a lot of, you know, pundits, political pundits, podcasters and whatnot, you know, they're good at that. Oh, that sounds great. That sounds fantastic. Or even artists who write these very thought-provoking, sensitive, insightful, caring songs and lyrics, and then you hear that they've beaten their spouse, you know. So there's a I don't want to say major, but there's a considerable difference between thinking and speaking and acting and being, right? That getting your thoughts, or your words and your thoughts in line with your actions and deeds, getting those to match on a regular basis. That's the challenge, right? I can tell you it's a challenge because I've gotten better at it, but I'm still far from top notch in that department. My wife does a much better job, but you know, she's the mom. Most people would argue that it is not ethically justifiable to cheat, deceive, exploit, abuse, um, and harm others merely because one wants to, or simply because one has the raw power to do so. You know, that's not good. At the level of action, though, mere verbal agreement on general principles does not produce a world that honors human rights. Interesting. At the level of action, right? So that's what I'm talking about. Coming outside of your mind, outside of pontificating and philosophizing and giving advice. What about your action, right? Actions say more than words. Actions indeed say more than words, right? At the level of action, though, mere verbal agreement on general principles does not produce a world that honors human rights. So it's much harder to do and be than to act, to think and speak, right? There are too many ways by which humans can rationalize. There you go, that's a key word. Rapacious desire. Put that one up. Put that one up. You know, sometimes I don't always give you the definition. Learn how to look things up. That's your rapacious. That's a good word. I haven't seen that. I don't know if I've ever used that. I've seen it. I know what it means, but not very often. I can't remember the last rapacious. When was the last time I saw it? There are too many ways by which humans can rationalize their rapacious desires and feel self-justified in taking advantage of those who are weaker or less able to protect themselves. Right? Too many forces in human life, social groups, religions, political ideologies generate norms of right and wrong that ignore or distort ethical principles. That needs to be highlighted. Let's highlight that. Right. In the end, in the final analysis, humans are too skilled in the art of self-deception. Oh, there it is. Delusional. I bet you a lot of people don't know this stuff, right? You know, they don't teach. This is the stuff they need to learn. And you know, reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, it's nice. But you know, does everybody need to know reading and writing? Yeah. Okay. Math, science, history, you know, important stuff. But unless you're going to be using math or science, even history on a regular basis, those aren't really systemic needs. Most of those things will be taken care of, or will be exposed to those things in a secondary manner. You know, a lot of the programming out there uses mathematics, maybe even some scientific principles. If you're talking AI and whatnot, you know, expert systems, algorithms. But what is used on a what is fully and totally and absolutely systemic or used systemically by people, dusk to dawn, every day, every second, minute, hour of the day, right? Week, month, years. Right? That's the stuff. Critical thinking is there. That's one of those things that is essential to know, right? Anyways, in the end, humans are too skilled in the art of self-deception for mere verbal agreement on abstract ethical principles to translate into the reality of an ethically just world. That's interesting. Let's read that again. Humans are too skilled in the art of self-deception for mere verbal agreement. There you go. For mere verbal agreement on abstract ethical principles to translate into the reality of an ethically just world, right? That's why I've said, like philosophy, even theology, which is a form of philosophy, it all sounds great and fine and dandy, you know, when you're reading Nietzsche and Kant and Aristotle and whomever, right? All these great philosophers, it's great when you're reading it in an academic vacuum, right? A theoretical vacuum. But when the dirty, chaotic, unorganized aspect of everyday life is involved, those nice, clean, comfortable, great sounding philosophies, rules, and principles just kind of fall apart, you know. What happened to all your great philosophy? Well, I got pissed. Well, I got tired. Well, I lost my job. Well, I found out I was sick, right? So the human element comes in, the natural fallibility and needs of the human element comes in. And all those great ideas, ethical principles and whatnot, and great philosophy is kind of beep. I know, I've been there. I can talk a great talk, you know, when I'm comfortable and just philosophizing like now, you know. But actually applying and doing it, that's where the real challenge comes in. And you know, I'm not great at it either, but we all need to improve. It all begins with awareness. I'm a heck of a lot better than I used to be before I knew all this stuff. So I can tell you, this is not the end all or cure, but it is something that will help you improve. Further complicating the picture, the ethical thing to do is not always self-evident, even to those who are not necessarily self-deceived. There you go. So it's not self-evident, or you could say it's not obvious, right? And that's why you got to work at it and become aware, right? In complex situations, people with goodwill often disagree as to the application of this or that ethical principle to this or that concrete case. One and the same act often receives ethical praise from some and condemnation by others, right? That's why, you know, in the world of politics, left and right, I think most people are pretty just and ethical, but their concept of what their priorities, right, based on priorities, and or what they see, right, their concept of what is right and wrong, just and unjust, will differ because of different upbringings, different perceptions, different exposures, different experience level, and other things, right? Different upbringing. You know, I was brought up a Democrat or Republican or whatever. I was brought up a Christian or Muslim or Jewish. It all depends on how you were brought up. And one culture, religion, ideology, influence is not necessarily better or superior to the other, right? That's not the case, right? That should be, hopefully that's self-evident to most people. But if you don't think about that, if you're just inculcated, ingrained in a way of thinking, your point of view from all these, a collection of influences, you know, family and culture, and religion and place and space and time and whatever, you know, country, all those influences, you don't need, you're at the head of the wave, you know, this wave of influences is just pushing you forward. And you've never really done any, wait a minute, let me just turn around, look at the wave, pause and reflect. What's pushing me? What, you know, is this good? Is this bad? What about the other people's waves? What's pushing them? You know, we don't think that, you know. This is how I grew up. I think this way. I be this way. I'm a being this way. And it is what it is. We can put this dimension, excuse me, let me try again. We can put this dimension of the problem another way. However strongly motivated to do what is ethically right, people can do so only if they know what is ethically justified. And they cannot know this if they systemically confuse their sense of what is ethically right with their vested interests, personal desires, political ideologies, kind of what I was talking about, or social mores, or if they lack the capacity to reason with skill and discipline in an ethical domain. In that one sentence basically covered what I was rambling on in several paragraphs, right? Let's look at this again. Very important. However strongly motivated to do what is ethically right, people can do so only if they know, look at that, italicize to emphasize, right? Only if they know what is ethically justified. And they cannot know this if they systematically confuse their sense of what is ethically right with their vested interests, right? So I know what's right, but it's based in my interests, my personal desires. This is your point of view or my individual's point of view, my political ideologies, or my social mores, right? Or if they lack the capacity to reason with skill and discipline in the ethical domain. That's very important. So that's where humility comes into play. That's where an understanding of point of view and these terms and concepts, most of them, I don't want to say all, most of them are listed in that chart in was it chapter 2, 3, or 4? I forget where it was. Remember that there was 3 charts of terms. Most of what is spoken throughout the rest of the book they're going to be referring to those terms. That's why I got to do it. I'm telling you to do it. I don't even have it, but you should, put those terms on a piece of paper and pin it to the wall, because that's what they're, and good stuff to just, look at on a regular basis, right? So that you learn. Anyways, let's move forward. Because of complexities such as these, skilled ethical reasoning presupposes, comes before, right? I suppose so, right? I'm supposing now. If I presuppose, it's already been done before the occurrence, right? Right. I meet a young person. I've already presupposed young people to be annoying, problematic. So I'm going to treat that young person as I would, based on presupposition, treat other young people, right? Skilled ethical reasoning presupposes the art of self-critique and ethical self-examination. We must learn to check our thinking for egocentrism. There you go. There you go. Check our thinking. Right. We must learn to check our thinking for egocentrism, sociocentrism, and self-deception. Right. Bingo. This in turn requires development of the intellectual dispositions described earlier in the book. I was just talking about those terms, right? Including intellectual humility, intellectual integrity, and fair-mindedness. Right? So those intellectual dispositions described earlier in the book. It's funny, as I'm reading through this stuff, I talk about something, and then all of a sudden, right next paragraph or two, what I'm talking about appears. It's not like I've memorized this text, especially these later chapters. I really generally don't get this far in a semester, because most semesters are about 17 weeks, and we usually get maybe 12 chapters in. Believe me, that's enough to cover in 17 weeks. Anyways, so this is good for me too, right? Sound ethical reasoning often requires the thinker to recognize and get beyond the pitfalls of ethical judgment, ethical intolerance, self-deception, uncritical conformity. There you go. Bingo. Sound ethical reasoning often requires us to recognize when our reasoning is a reflection of our social indoctrination. Another key phrase, right? Sound ethical reasoning often requires us to enter empathically into points of view of others than our own, right? gather facts from alternative perspectives, question our assumptions, consider alternative ways to put the question at issue. So, empathically, that's a good word. I haven't used that. I don't know if I've used that. But it's empathy, right? Enter empathically into points of view other than our own, right? So you're looking at through empathy of others, to feel for others, right? Their point of view, not just yours, right? Gather facts from alternative perspectives. Questions are assumptions, like I was just doing with that assumption. Young people, I presuppose young people are all blah, 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 blah. Assumptions can be highly problematic. That's another term that is what you will find in that chart, along with point of view. Few adults, however, require the skills or insight. Few. There it is. Most adults don't, even if they've gone to college. Sorry, college grad. Maybe 10, 15, 20% do, right? 70, 80% don't. However, require the skills or insights to recognize complexities inherent in many everyday ethical issues. Few people identify their own ethical contradictions or clearly distinguish their vested interests and egocentric desires from what is genuinely ethical. So there you've got to be strong. You've got to be open. You've got to be humble. You've got to be willing to do the right thing. You got to be willing to overcome egocentric or sociocentric type of thinking. Hard, difficult. You almost got to be a saint. I think somebody said one time, the best critical thinker is part scientist, part philosopher, part saint. Something like that, right? The characteristics of those individuals, all in there in critical thinking. Few have thought about the counterfeits, nice word, of ethical sentiment and judgment, or have thought through a coherent ethical perspective in light of the complexity of the pitfalls of ethical reasoning. As a result, everyday ethical judgments are often an unconscious, there it is, unconscious mixture of genuine counterfeit ethics. I like that. Of ethical insight on the one hand and prejudice and hypocrisy on the other. Oh, that's good stuff. Each in a web of beliefs that seem to the believer to be self-evidently true. And that's all a part of the self-delusion. Right? Inadvertently, we pass on to our children and students our own ethical blindness, ethical distortions, and closed-mindedness. There it is, right? So, and a lot of that is passed on, right? We are, the Johnsons, the Smiths, whatever, and that's how we are, right? We're of a particular geographic locale, from a particular country, from a particular religion, from a particular culture, from a particular political party, from a particular socioeconomic status, from a particular. Right? And then you take those particulars and add them up. What's the sum of the equation? That's your point of view. That's what you're filtering how you're perceiving life through that point of view, all those particulars. As a result, many who trumpet most loudly for ethics to be taught in schools merely want students to adopt their own beliefs and perspectives, right? And you hear this in the, however flawed they are. You hear this in the political arena, right? Oh, it's important that we be honest and tried and true and just and freedom of speech and blah, blah. As long as all that stuff agrees with what we believe, we don't want you speaking freely if what you're saying counters what our beliefs, right? So we're full of hypocrisy, right? It happens all the time in many areas of life. Right? They take themselves to have the truth in their pockets, right? I like that. That's true. Right? They take their perspective to be exemplary of all ethical truth. I like that. What these same people fear most is someone else's ethical uh, perspective taught as the truth. Conservatives afraid of liberals being in charge. There you go. Liberals fearful of conservatives, theists or non-theists, non-theists of theists, and so on and so forth. Right? All of these fears are justified. People, except in the most rare and exceptional cases, have a strong tendency to confuse what they believe with the truth. There you go. I believe it. I've always believed it. My family has always believed it. So it's got to be true. How can it last, that belief last generations and not be true? I've always believed it. I can't not believe it. We've believed it. It's what we believe. It's what we are. Generationally. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to, you know, knock that down or pull that apart or negate that, right? It's true because I believe it is, as we have already emphasized, a deep subconscious mindset. And most of us, our beliefs simply feel like truth. They appear in the mind as the truth, and the normal human mind is always others who are, yeah, it's, you don't, we don't, you or the particular group you're in or believe in, you know, you'll hear it even in sports. You know, you're the greatest fans in the world, and then every fan will say that about their fellow fans, or the team that they're fans of will say that the best fans in the world, right? And then the next team, to the best fans in the world, then the next team, you know, same thing, right? To the best party in the world, to the best religion in the world, to the best fill in the blank, right? And the normal human mind is always others who do evil or deceive, self-interested, closed-minded, never us. Oh no, not me. I am an angel. Thus, instead of cultivating genuine ethical principles in students, teachers often unknowingly indoctrinate them, uh, systematically rewarding students for expressing the beliefs and perspective the teachers themselves hold. Bingo. Right. Right. To this extent, they indoctrinate, and that this is a problem with education. It's nothing new, right? And it's not unique to one country or another. All right, a little bit more. To become skilled in any domain of reasoning, we must understand the principles that define that domain. To be skilled in mathematical, highlight that. To be skilled in mathematical reasoning, we must understand the fundamental mathematical principles, right? Get the definition, get the standards, get the vocabulary, right? It all begins at the beginning. To be skilled in scientific reasoning, you must understand fundamental scientific principles, principles of physics, chemistry, and so forth in like manner. To be skilled in ethical reasoning, you must understand fundamental ethical principles, good-heartedness, not enough. You must be well grounded in fundamental ethical concepts and principles. Principles are at the heart of ethical reasoning. And the fact that an issue is ethical does not mean that you can abandon your commitment to disciplined, rational thought. People think through an ethical issue must be able to identify the ethical principles relevant to the specific ethical situation. They must also muster the intellectual skills required to apply these principles fairly to the relevant case situation. Ethical principles alone, however, do not settle ethical questions. For example, ethical principles sometimes can be applied differently in cases that are ethically complex. True. And here's an example. Should the United States maintain relations with countries that violate human rights? Right. And you can read through that example here. Pause it. Right. You can read through that yourself. Because ethical reasoning is often complex, we must learn strategies to deal with these complexities. Here's your 3 intellectual tasks that the authors believe are the most important to ethical reasoning. Mastering the most basic ethical concepts and the principles inherent in ethical issues. Learning to distinguish between ethics and other domains of thinking, with which ethics is commonly confused. Learning to identify when native human egocentrism and sociocentrism are impeding one's ethical judgment. If any of these 3 foundations is missing in a person's ethical reasoning, that reasoning will likely be flawed. Let's consider these abilities. Bingo. That's and here again, most important, right? You're always going to get keywords and phrases, especially in educational texts that know what they're doing. We'll point out those things that are essential to learn, right? And then that goes on. That starts a new section. That's got a bunch of examples in that. So I think we'll stop there for now. We'll pick up with ethical concepts and principles next time. And that's it. Take care. See you soon.